We were coming down on a point called Gray's Point. I jump up, I look out the window, and I see this bridge pier coming at us. I immediately just kind of laid down on my bed because I knew how bad the impact was going to be, and it threw my bed all the way across the room. Within 5 minutes of all this happening, 5 barges have sank to the bottom. They're just gone. It took us 3 days to clean that up. It was a big mess. And that was one of them that definitely shut the river down for a while.
The Mississippi River has a long and complex history. From Native American use of the river and Mark Twain's colorful tales to major engineering marvels and idyllic, impressive travelogues, the river has captured the hearts and minds of many.
The 2,300-mile-long river serves as a vital artery for the American transportation system, moving grain, coal, lumber, and petroleum products, and a host of other cargo.
As a matter of fact, 92% of United States agriculture exports and 78% of grain fed to livestock travel via the Mississippi River.
The cargo is transported in large barges, and shepherding these platforms up and down the river has its hazards. The captains operating the tugs, or push boats moving these barges, have to be real experts in order to manage these risks.
And we've always wanted to talk to a tugboat captain, or in this case, a pushboat captain, and we luckily managed to connect with Captain Doicus Langley, who drives the boats for Marquette Marine.
Speaking of water, many thanks to our sponsor for this season of the Adrenaline Zone, Culligan. With Culligan's drinking water systems, you can get the ultra-filtered water you need to fuel your high-performance lifestyle right on tap. Learn more at Culligan.com.
And we caught up with Captain Langley while he was off watch during a trip moving empty barges back up the Mississippi. Well, welcome to the Adrenaline Zone, and we've always wanted to have a riverboat tug driver on the show, so thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Super excited. It's a pleasure.
So, Captain, everybody starts somewhere. We all have a story, and we'd like to know, have our listeners be able to hear from you. Where'd you grow up, and kind of what got you interested in being out on the water?
My upbringing, where I grew up, really, as boring as it sounds, it had nothing to do with the water on the Mississippi River. But as a kid, I was very immersed in water. I mean, we were always on the river or a lake. My dad was an avid boater from a very early age. Probably one of the first things I had as a vehicle would have been a skiff of some type that I would have, probably at age 8, been taking out on the river by myself. So it was a fun time, and really taught me an appreciation for the water, and just that I got to give that to my dad. So my grandfather was also in the marine industry, but I really didn't know a whole lot about that, growing up. I mean, it was kind of, I would hear his stories later as I'm getting into my teen years. I really became more kind of aware of what he was as a captain, what he did, and more impressed by that as I got a little older.
And you ended up as a deckhand.
Ended up as a deckhand. I started for a company out of Sabine Pass, and that was OMS, Offshore Marine Specialties. And I worked for as a deckhand for them for a little over a year, doing laddering jobs. We would go out off Southwest Pass, off of Houston, sometimes up to about 200 miles out. We had some ships that couldn't come within U.S. waters, and we would go out and put out the big Yokohama fenders. They were 30-something feet long, 20-some-odd feet high, and we would keep 4 of them on the back of a 200-foot supply vessel, and then we would let them off into the water. They're chained all together with a cable, and we would put them alongside the super tankers, and then the regular small tankers that you see coming into Houston and New Orleans, and then all of our ports along the coast. they would come alongside, and that was what they used to keep the ships from crashing together. So very interesting job as a deckhand.
There's a certain romantic element to being in the on the river, but I think you're showing us that there's also a hard work, grueling aspect of it. Do you enjoy the river piece more? Because Mississippi, of course, is a major river, and I'm sure that's really entertaining to go up and down it. Or do you enjoy the open water stuff?
Back when I was on the open water, and it was a very small portion of my career, probably 5 years total on and off. When I was on the open water, I loved it. I really didn't know much about the inland river system. So that just came later in my career. I had no idea this is where I would end up, but it is a very, vast, large industry, and there's a lot of opportunity. And when you start into it, I wouldn't say people start in and go into the river industry and move on to other things much. Typically, people that start in the river industry stay there, but it definitely happens frequently the opposite direction. It's, the river industry, the lifestyle we live here is much better than what we had offshore back when I worked out there.
So you eventually became captain working for
Yes.
Marquette Marine on the river. Tell us, how long it took to do that, what you had to do in order to do it, and what kind of licensing and certification you've got to have as somebody running big barges on the river.
I had my grandfather was a captain, so that early on when I was working as a deckhand, I had a wife at home, a son at home, one on the way. I was very, I wanted to move up. I knew I didn't want to stay on deck. So that was kind of in my radar. And following in the footsteps of my grandfather. And then I had a brother, an older brother that was 4 years older than me. And he had just recently moved up from deckhand to captain, working for Collie Towing, which is the company I would eventually get my captain's license with years ago in 1996. So, yeah, that's just watching him move up. That's kind of what really led me in that direction and kept me motivated.
And you've got a certification process. I'm sure that, they don't just go, "Hey, congratulations, today you're."
Well, that's a funny story. So I listened to my grandfather's stories from years before. He was a World War II veteran in the Navy, gets out of the Navy and starts working on the inland waterway. There was, from what he said, in the late 40s and early 50s, there was just a handful of boats that worked tow lines on the inland waterway. And his first job was as a deckhand. He rode one trip, came back for the next hitch, goes home, comes back. The captain doesn't show up, and he's hired as the captain. And
Oh my
that's how he
gosh.
started his captain's career. And he was a captain from then on. And he has we could do a whole podcast on his career alone. So it's a very colorful, a lot of those stories I could not tell though out of there. They get very, very colorful.
But that's probably not how it happened for you, right?
No, so we have progressed, and I think in a good way, with what I had to go through as a deckhand, an AB, a tankerman, and then on to get my captain's license. That process is a lot. It's more straightforward now. It's more laid out, so more people can take advantage of it, and it's a clearer path. But the way that looks is you come out, and within a 5-year period, I tell guys coming onto the boat, one of the great things about this industry is if you apply yourself within a 5-year period, you can be sitting in the wheelhouse running a boat, maybe not as a captain, but as a pilot. And there's not a lot of industries where you can do that. And, those steps after a year on deck as a deckhand, most guys serve more a year and a half, 2 years, and then they can go to the Coast Guard, apply and set. You don't have to go to school. You can study on your own. Most people go to one of the maritime schools. They'll go to a maritime school for normally about 4 weeks, and then they set for their apprentice mate license, which is a training license that allows you to steer in the wheelhouse with a designated examiner captain. So that's how the first phase of that starts.
Huh. So after only 4 weeks, you can start driving under a watcher.
Under
huh?
supervision.
Yeah.
You get your
Under
learner's permit.
supervision, and that's why I have no hair. So I'm that supervisor a lot of the times, and those, definitely I would say the first 3 months of having someone in the wheelhouse steering is the most hectic for the wheelman that's doing the training, because they typically don't know how to, and I'm looking left to right because I'm looking at my, on a conventional boat, they would be called sticks, but I'm looking at my steering. They don't have any idea of the basics. So as you're steering up the river and you're teaching them the basic fundamentals. So it's a little tougher. Once they have that down, then they can follow just simple commands that you give them to keep them out of trouble.
So that kind of ties in though to the fact that, you're on a state-of-the-art tug, and how you steer a ship or pilot a ship has a lot to do with the technology of the tug or the type of tug. And there's probably a lot of specialized instruments and technology on board. So can you talk a little bit about the ships and maybe how they've changed a little bit over the years to make it easier or harder to operate?
When I first started, we had really nothing but a radar. Some of the vessels I worked on, they were the old style radar where you would actually look into the cups and you had to tweet. By the way, those are some of the best working radars we ever had. That in a lot of ways things have gotten better, but those were great. But we had a radar and we had a good compass, and that was it. And a lot of navigating, it was just different back then. And then we progressed up to the point where we had some type of navigation system, some type of charting, electronic charting, that really advanced things quite a bit. And it made it so we could run in inclement weather. We still will do what we need to do to make sure we have a safe watch, but it doesn't put us in really bad positions when we have that bad weather where we're just blind. So the charting system we have is state of the art. It shows our tow size, the tow configuration. It shows the speed at which I'm moving. And not only does it show my speed, but it shows a predictor that shows me, or predicts, it's not always perfect, but it predicts where my vessel in tow is going to be in 2 minutes. And you can adjust that. You can adjust that 3 minutes to 1 minute. Everybody has their own preference, but yeah, the technology has came a long way. We use a Rose Point system. I know offshore, you get into like a Actis, more of a regulated system for offshore. And I know a lot of the ships, I would assume the Navy ships have probably went more in the direction of like Furuno based Actis charting.
Yeah. And for our listeners, an ECDIS is an electronic chart display information system that feeds the radar onto the chart. So you literally see a contact on the chart where the vessel is you're trying to avoid or whatever. It's a pretty cool system.
Quick question though, do you still train the apprentice pilots on how to use the radar and the compass in case all the fancy electronic stuff fails?
Yes,
Is that still part of the training?
absolutely. that is an ongoing training from the time, typically they're in the wheelhouse for a year, year and a half training to be turned loose. That's after they get their apprentice mate license. They have that for 1 year, and then they can apply to have that upgraded to a full pilot's license or a captain's license. It's a pilot's license. They do a pilot for 1 year, and then they're a captain. That doesn't necessarily have to follow their apprenticeship time on the vessel steering. Sometimes that they're possibly ready to go early and they're waiting on the captain's license to mature and to step up to a pilot before they can be turned loose and steer the boat by themselves. And then sometimes that takes a little longer and they may have their full pilot's license. The last guy that I just steered has his full pilot's license, but he's still steering in the steersman program for Marquette. So he hasn't been turned loose yet.
You're moving big, heavy stuff on the river. So talk to us about the barges, how big they are, how many you can connect to at a time, what they're carrying. And, and you're not, by the way, we use the word tug, but you're actually pushing them, right?
Most people in this industry, we all call them push boats. I think technically they're considered a tugboat through the Coast Guard. Think if you look at harbor tugs, and I did that, that was part of my career as well. When I worked at College Towing, is we did ship assist docking, where we docked ships. That would be, most people in the marine industry and the inland industry would call those harbor tugs. So you have harbor tugs, you have push boats, which is what I'm on, which is just any boat with a square bow instead of a mono bow like a harbor tug would have. It has a square bow and it's made to face up on barges and push those.
Yeah. So tell us about the barges.
So each barge, they have changed over the years too. When I first got into the industry, we would occasionally push these small barges called lash barges, which were just a pain. They were no good because they didn't really match up with the other barges that we had. And then we had a regulation hopper barge that was a 195, so 195 feet long, 35 feet wide. And then they started building 200 feet hopper barges. The locks did not like that at all because the locks are only 600 feet long. So if you have 200 foot hopper barges, it doesn't give a lot of room. You're talking inches as far as how you're fitting inside the lock chamber. And they're very particular about that because of damage being done to their gates. So that was, now the standard is 200 feet. So years ago, 15, 20 years ago, a lock would not let you even lock through with a 600-foot cut. Now that's just standard. That's just what we lock through. They're just used to it. And we've, kind of did some things to mitigate those dangers and make it safe.
Does Marquette own the barges as well as the push boats, or are the barges somebody else?
Marquette has, don't hold me to this number, but approximately 800 barges that they own and operate. So yeah, that's one big benefit of Marquette in the industry wise is it makes them very, I guess, for a customer that's looking at Marquette, it makes it a package deal and makes everything flow a little smoother. Getting barges point A to point B, getting mainly moving product.
So is it then a pretty competitive business? It sounds like there are tug companies or push boat companies appropriately that don't have barges. You guys have a barge, but overall it probably is a pretty small community, even if it's competitive, right?
Our companies are all have, most of them all have their own barge fleets. I know it's competitive on the sales side. So we don't get involved in that too much out here other than we like to kind of know what's going on. just because it's, Marquette. I mean, it's a very, I like to just consider it as a family company. It's a large company now. It was a lot smaller when I hired on, but it really has a family feeling to it. So the captains out on the boats and the crews like to have a little knowledge of that, but that competitive side of it mainly is in the sales, and just like any companies would compete to move products. As far as we go out here, I think there's some competitiveness, but it's very small. I think everybody works together as an industry to keep things moving. And that's one really amazing thing about what we do, is you have all these different companies, but we're all colleagues and we all feel that way. We're all merchant mariners. So we work together.
Water is the ultimate health drink. With Culligan's filtration systems, you'll get the superior quality and pure tasting, ultra refreshing hydration you can count on to power your performance.
Culligan's smart reverse osmosis systems take it to the next level, helping you set hydration goals, track how much you're drinking, and even see what contaminants are reduced in your water.
That means you're always getting the exceptional water you need to feel truly good inside and out, ready to face the day and whatever challenges it brings. Culligan, water you love.
So let's say, Captain, I am a grain of wheat and I get loaded into a barge in Minnesota near the Twin Cities, and I'm going to come down the river to New Orleans. Talk us through how that happens. There's probably 3 200-foot barges lashed together. You're locked in there right behind them. And if I'm not mistaken, it's not one tug that takes it all the way down the river, right? There's a different setup going through the locks, northern half, southern half. Talk us through that if you could.
Yes, there definitely can be multiple tugs that would do that. So right now, the way the river system is, it has changed over the years. We used to be able to take 12 loads, even 15 out of the Twin Cities. Now that doesn't happen. The river system just isn't, particularly above Lock 3, it's just not in good enough shape. The size of it doesn't support coming out with 12 loads. So they would do 6 loads, 3 wide and 2 long. Then maybe stack some empties on top of that if they needed some empties shifted south. Those barges would be put together by a fleet tug up in St. Paul. The harbor is right there, downtown St. Paul. And those barges would be shifted down and starting, through the lock system all the way down to St. Louis. As we're moving down the river, you may stop at Red Wing. That's a place that we stop a lot to pick up a few more barges. And at Red Wing, you're far enough down the river where you don't have those restrictions. You can go ahead and start doing what we call it filling out. So you start picking up barges at different ports all the way down till you get to St. Louis. And by the time, well before you get to St. Louis, typically you have a 15 barge tow. So you're 5 long, 3 wide, you're talking 1,800 tons per barge on average, and, 1,000 feet long with the boat. You're an easy 1,150 feet long.
That's an aircraft carrier right there.
And then once we get to St. Louis, 2 of those tows will be combined. So they'll combine 2 of those tows. Tugs will help with that again. Marquette does that a little differently. Sometimes they will bypass the St. Louis Harbor, go just below St. Louis Harbor, and they'll let 2 of their boats coming off the upper combine 30 barges together. And then one of our lower boats, like the boat I work on, will turn those boats. So when we get turn orders, we will have an empty tow coming northbound. Sometimes we have loads within that tow. Certain commodities go northbound, for salt is a good example. almost all the salt that's spread all over the Midwest is brought up by barges out of Louisiana. So those two 30 barge tows will be combined together. We will swap tows where the lower boat will give the upper boat our tow, and then we'll take that lower tow, 30 barges combined, and we'll continue south. And then we may, just depending on the river conditions, we could possibly fill out to as many as 42 on this boat. Doesn't happen very often, but a lot of times we'll fill out to 35 or 36. The 36 typically were 6 wide by 6 long. And then we continue all the way down. And from the time you clear St. Louis, there's no locks. So there's really not a whole lot southbound other than incidents and, things that would stop the whole river system. There's not a whole lot of things that would slow you down. It's about a 3-day trip from St. Louis down to New Orleans.
You must have an immense amount of horsepower.
I was thinking the same thing.
In order to just push the thing, much less make it turn. It's incredible.
Typically with a 35 to 36 barge tow, you're going to have 7,200 and up in horsepower. The boat I'm on has 6,600, but it is a sea drive boat. So it's one of the newer technologies out. It has a lot of steering capability. So it has pods underneath it. And some of our shipping industry uses the same technology where you'll have a bow thruster that comes down out of the front of the ship, and that bow thruster can turn 360 degrees. It doesn't have a forward and reverse. It doesn't, the propeller doesn't turn direction. It spins forward all the time, and the whole pod turns to just thrust. So we have 3 of those on the back of this vessel. We had 3 2,200 horsepower pods. And that's what, we use for propulsion.
And you got like a joystick for each one of those things, or I guess
we do. We have. It's a. I can show you if you'd like to see
our audio listeners probably wouldn't.
Yeah,
wouldn't
I
be able to
can.
see
I
it,
can
so.
describe it. It's about yay size. It has a throttle on top, and the whole joystick spins 360 degrees. So it's very easy to operate from up here. Operating with a tow in front of you is very straightforward. It's really similar to a conventional style boat, where you really get the benefit on these boats. And the reason the Coast Guard has even categorized us so that you have these horsepower regulations when you have high water situations. And you have to have a certain amount of horsepower per barge that you carry. And it actually kind of equates out to per ton that you have. So for the tonnage that you carry, you have a horsepower rating that you have to have. On the Z drives, they have lowered that regulation to allow us to be able to carry larger tows because we have so much control. But it allows us, we do something called flanking when you're transiting down the lower Mississippi River, and they use it on the upper as well, where we will slow down to at or below current speed, and we let the Mississippi River current take us around the turn. So that has been the standard
clever.
back all the way back when you had paddle wheel boats pushing tows. That was how they would navigate very sharp, hard turns in the river system.
Yeah, because it really zigs and zags down past St. Louis.
Yes,
a lot.
It does.
How fast do you average?
Now, I said sometimes that's a necessity that we have to back up and flank to keep things safe. Sorry, I interrupted you.
What's your average speed that you're going typically down the river?
Well, for us, anything over 10 miles an hour southbound is fast. You get up to 12 and 13 and we're really doing something. So I know to most people that aren't like immersed in the marine industry, that doesn't sound very fast. but it is. And you know, a really funny, quick story about that is when I first started out here and I first had the capability of videoing making a bridge, which for us is just like you're like tense, and especially early in your career, it seems like it moves so fast. You're doing 10 miles an hour southbound, you're coming around a turn, you're looking at a bridge, and you're making that bridge and go and continuing south. But it's very stressful, and it's like white knuckle. You feel like you're in an Indy car. But when you video it and you show it to somebody at home, it's like crickets. It's like it's like about a minute and a half
Slow
into
motion.
it, your kids are like, "Dad's when's something gonna happen? This is like super boring." So yeah.
Are we there
You're
yet?
like, I got my heart in my throat right now, but it's going really slow.
Oh, that's
I
so
love it.
funny. So, you know, I grew up in the St. Louis area, and of course, the Mississippi was a big part of our lives. And we were constantly warned away from hanging out on the riverside because of the shifting sandbanks, and you're not quite sure if you're going to fall into the river. So I know there are a lot of hazards on the river, not only the shifting sandbars and things, but the currents. We were warned about that. There was always barges going up and down, so there's a lot of traffic density. So, how did you deal with all these different hazards on the river and navigate through them or manage them?
I think for most people, the river can be, you know, most of what they see about the river is on the news. Somebody drowns. You know, unfortunately, that is the publicity that gets put out there. So that to me gives the river a really bad name. There are people on the river that use it for recreation. We see it all the time, not as much as you would think, you know, like lakes up in Minnesota or the Gulf. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's definitely not that level of pleasure boat traffic, but it's safe as long as you're careful and as long as you can respect the barge traffic. That's where it becomes dangerous. Is when
Yeah.
people in pleasure boats have no idea what we're doing and what restrictions we have. So, as far as us mitigating the sandbars, I mean, the Corps of Engineers tries to do the best job they can. They do as good a job as they can, and what they do gets us down the river safely. They place buoys up and down the river to give us, you know, a channel that we can navigate in. That is a tough job because, as you can imagine, as the river goes up and down, it is constantly shifting. And the sandbars, as you said, constantly shift and form, you know, differently every time the river comes up and goes back down. So a lot of times southbound, if the river has been stable, we kind of know what to expect. If the river is rising or falling, especially falling, we're kind of leery of trusting where the buoys are or where they were, or the virtual buoys on our charts. We have a thing called a virtual buoy, and that is regulated and put in by the Corps of Engineers as well.
Hopefully, the river changes slowly enough that they can keep up, but you still got to be pretty careful, particularly when you're passing another, heavily laden push boat that has a lot of barges, and you're in a narrow area, right?
On the Mississippi River system, on the lower, there's a lot of different areas, and normally the northbound traffic. One of the things that you learn as a steersman is where you can meet people, where you can't meet people. So the way the inland river system works is the southbound vessel proposes the place and uh, manner of passing. So if I'm southbound, I'll call up a northbound vessel and say, "Hey, I would like to see you on the one whistle at, you know, this light or this mile marker," or, you know, however you want to phrase it. But you want to be able to give that information to the northbound vessel so he knows where to stop.
And I'm assuming that's because you have more control if you're northbound because of the current.
Definitely. Yep. The northbound vessel has more control, and they're able to stop and get back underway much easier than the southbound vessel.
So what's happened in I'm sure at some point in the history of barge traffic on the Mississippi, somebody's run aground. Does that kind of block the
Yeah.
whole river for everybody else? How do you deal with that? That's a lot of mass to move if you're stranded on a sandbank somewhere.
Normally on the lower, unless it's really low water, there are times where somebody running aground will shut down the whole river, in that area. And the
Uh-huh.
Coast Guard will put a pontoon out, and they'll shut the river down from miles so and so down to miles so and so. Nobody can transit until we get that mess cleaned up. So it
Uh-huh.
happens on a monthly basis, and we try our best when we're navigating down the river, but at the end of the day, the way we're navigating, it's not the same as offshore. You're even before we had all this technology that we have now, you could steer a compass route, you could steer a compass heading, and most of the time you have nothing in your way. You're maybe checking for drift every once in a while, and it's kind of straightforward. On the river, it's not like that at all. You are minute by minute, you're
Yeah.
assessing what's happening, and you're reassessing, and every time you're making an educated guess. I mean, you are guessing, I'm going to give this input into my steering, this input into my throttles, and I think that it's going to get me where I want to be. And then a minute or two later, if that doesn't happen, you readjust again, and if that doesn't happen, you readjust. And that is not always good enough, especially when you're not sure what is underneath you. You're not sure how the sandbar is out in front of you. So certain stages of river, it definitely gets kind of treacherous, and accidents are going to happen. It's just a part of the industry.
So do you have any particularly hairy stories you want to share?
So yes, I definitely,
It sounds nerve-wracking.
it can
Yeah.
be very nerve wracking, especially early in your career. The later you get in your career, it's not as bad. I still, it's not that I won't treat it with respect, but I'm definitely more relaxed now. Um, I had, as far as the river industry goes, the worst incident I've ever been involved with, I wasn't up on watch for. Did watch change about an hour before this incident happened, and we're in Cape Girardeau. So we're southbound Cape. It's actually really similar river conditions right now. You have a 5-foot difference in between the Cape river gauge and the Cairo. And when those two are separated, that section of river is very swift. You have sometimes a 6-7 mile an hour current. And it makes, transiting that a little more difficult. We were coming southbound with 30 loads. We crew changed or watch change. So I was getting off watch. The pilot was coming on watch at 11 o'clock at night. We were coming down on a point called Gray's Point. Gray's Point is just a notorious, dangerous point. There's lots of rock. That point does not want you to transit south for whatever reason. It just doesn't. So most people back up and flank there to make it safe if you have any sizable tow. And the gentleman that took over for me that night just made a bad judgment and overflanked. Well, when he overflanked, he thought that he would be able to correct it by driving ahead, and eventually he would be able to correct that. Well, you come down around Gray's Point, and I'm trying to draw a visual picture here. I'm not the greatest at this. But you come down around Gray's Point, and then you're looking down the river at Thebes Bridge, and it's a railroad bridge in a turn that has the piers are just scarred up to no end. I mean, it's been hit so many times over the years. It's commonly hit. So he overflanks, which puts him out of shape for that bridge. As he's driving down, he never does get in shape, and we end up. I don't know any of this is happening. I'm getting ready to get in bed, so I'm sitting on the side of my bed in my stateroom, and the newer boats have built-in furniture. Everything's built in, kind of like an offshore ship, some type of ship would have. The older boats had just regular home furniture, just dressers and just, everything. If you got into an accident, things were going all over the place. So I hear the general alarm go on. I look out my starboard window of my stateroom. I jump up, I look out the window, and I see this bridge pier coming at us. And it's coming at the starboard stern barge. So we've got 30 barges in front of us, and the stern of the starboard side is going at this bridge pier. It hits it so hard that it breaks the whole boat out of tow. The tows are held in to the barges with cables. And like on this boat, we do 32 parts of cables. On the boat we were on that night, we probably had 26 parts out. It broke every one of them instantly, killed both engines, died instantly. The hit was so hard. I immediately just kind of laid down on my bed because I knew how bad the impact was going to be, and it threw my bed all the way across the room. Dresser laid over, refrigerators downstairs in the floor. It was a hard impact. The worst I've ever been involved in. Within, I run up to the wheelhouse, and part of the job as a captain on a boat, so when you have an incident like that, you come straight to the wheelhouse. The pilot would do the same thing, but the captain is obligated to take over if he deems that necessary. So when I got to the wheelhouse, I immediately took over. We're just floating down the river at this point. We get the engines cranked back up. Within 5 minutes of all this happening, 5 barges have sank to the bottom right there. They're just gone. And it took us 3 days to clean that up.
Wow.
It was a big mess. And that was one of them that definitely shut the river down for a while. So that was 20 years ago. That's been a while. That was in 2003. So a little over 20 years, 21.
But the bridge survived.
The bridge survived. It has been hit just like that.
Yeah. Well, it just goes to show that this is a business where you really got to pay attention.
Yeah,
To
absolutely.
what's going on, and experience really counts. That's amazing. What a story. So you're on the push boat, and you've got a small crew. You've got some deckhands. You got a mate, whatever. What's the dynamic like working closely with a small crew for extended periods on your boat?
It can be great. I mean, it really is like a family away from home. It can also be as bad as you can imagine, like a squabbling family at home, like you're having issues. So it can go both directions.
Especially if the food's bad, right?
It can go both directions, but all in all, I've always enjoyed my time on the boat. I would say that's one thing that has kept me out here is just the dynamic of the cruise. And Marquette, along with other companies, definitely does a lot to help promote that. And part of our training that we go through helps us deal with crew issues as they come along. The workforce that we're working with now, it's constantly changing. So you're constantly having to learn how to, mitigate that, and not just mitigate it, but roll with it, make it work well.
Every generation is different. But before I forget, I got to ask, do you have a cook?
I
Or
was
is it like
going
a fire-
there. I was totally going there.
or is it like a firehouse
What's the
where
food
somebody
like?
gets the, yeah.
No, we definitely have a cook, and that is a pivotal part on a line boat.
Oh, nice.
So I haven't referred to these boats as line boats. So in the industry, anything that pushes 15 barges or more are generally referred to as line boats. And unfortunately, for all the other boats in the industry, and I was a part of that for a long time, I came up off of small boats. The line boats are generally the only ones that have cooks. And it is wonderful to have a cook. I would never go back to working without one. Not only does a good cook cook good food, but that dynamic you were talking about, they can be like a mom on the boat. And when I say that, I use that very broadly. Like a mom, I don't care if your family has two dads or if it has, you know, uh, two moms. It's the same. It's just it doesn't matter who it is. They can be the
Yeah,
person who kind
dynamic.
of holds everything together and creates that cohesiveness with the whole crew. And that's because they're down there in the center of the whole boat. I mean, everybody's always kind of moving around the boat and it's centered around the galley. So yeah, it's a really special position, I feel like.
That's so funny because on space station, it's all about the food and eating together at meals. We don't have a cook. Our food's not as good, but there's something about food and that brings people together socially, and it's got it just the glue that sticks. It's really interesting. You have the same dynamic on the boat. Um, yeah. So, question. A little bit broader family. You talked earlier about everybody on the river is kind of an extended family. Do you know most of the other captains then on the river? As you guys pass, you kind of wave at each other and stuff, or is it big enough that you don't know all the other captains on the river?
We know each other by voice, not so much by name, but we do recognize voices a lot. It's kind of funny as you move up and down the river. Typically, you know when there's a new voice that you haven't heard, and you're a little wary of where they're going to be for you if you decide to meet them in a spot where it may be a little close. So a lot of where you're going to meet somebody depends on, do you recognize their voice?
Oh, how interesting.
Now, you really know very few. You tend to, even if you've been with one company for a long time, most captains settle on one boat. Maybe they move around to several, and you meet a dozen captains over, a 5-year period that by sight. But mainly it's just talking over the radio, and it's not like a personal friendship type thing.
We're just about out of time, Captain. Curious, though, what advice would you give to somebody who's interested in being a tugboat captain or a pushboat captain on the river? Is it something you'd recommend, or what's the best thing for somebody to do who's thinking about taking that on?
That there's definitely a huge need for people out on the river, for merchant mariners in general. It doesn't have to be the river; it can be anywhere in the U.S. There's definitely if you come out here and you commit yourself to this job, and I tell guys on the boat, when they reach a certain point as a deckhand, I will talk to guys and let them know, the biggest piece of advice I can give you is you have your home life. Maybe they've got kids at home, a wife at home, and then you have your boat life. You've got to, at some point in your career, be able to dedicate yourself to the boat while you're on the boat. Dedicate yourself. That's your home. You're going to do everything possible to take care of it and put that as your highest priority. Now, you have emergencies at home, something comes up. I understand that. That's your first priority in life. But when you're on the boat, this is your job, just like any other job. So that's kind of a hard thing with newer guys coming on, is they struggle with being able to let go of that home life, especially with the technology we have where they can be constantly immersed into being on a phone conversation or even on video phone with loved ones at home. So you have to learn how to let that go. Other than that, the jobs are here. I mean, all you have to do is apply yourself, go through the steps. The path is there, it's clear, and there's nothing else that I know of where you can be from a entry level position into a captain's position really within 3.5, 4 years, but 5 years for sure. You could be doing that for almost any company you chose to start with.
Wow, that's impressive. Well, I think we're going to have to call it a day because we're running out of time, but I have really enjoyed this conversation, especially having seen barges, travel up and down the Mississippi my whole life to get some insight into, a peek behind the curtain, as it were, how that all works has been really fascinating. So thank you very much, Captain Langley, for being with us. And I'm sure our listeners are going to be fascinated with this information.
Yeah, it's been terrific. Really enjoyed it. I learned so much, and I've always been curious, and you helped me satisfy that curiosity. So thank you.
That was Mississippi Pushboat Captain Doicus Langley. I'm Sandra Magnus.
And I'm Sandy Winnefeld. Thanks again to Culligan for sponsoring this episode. Get exceptional water for exceptional performance. Learn more at culligan.com.
Please pass our podcast around to your friends, and we'll see you next week with another fun episode of The Adrenaline Zone.